CodePen is really cool. But what if I told you you could use React to create your very own CodePen, and it's actually fairly simple? Also, if you enjoyed this project and want to take your React skills to the next level, make sure to check out my full React course I'll have linked down in the description below. Let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now to get started, here's the complete final version of my CodePen project. You can see we can modify our HTML, and it's going to update down here. We can modify our CSS by making this, for example, yellow, and it's going to update down below. And we can even modify our JavaScript. Let's make this blue, and you can see it'll update down below. We can expand and collapse all of these as needed to make it so we can emphasize exactly what we're focusing on. And really this does everything CodePen does, including saving your work. So if I refresh the page, you can see that all of my work has been saved on my computer so I can continue to work on it later. So let me show you exactly how to create this. The very first thing I've done is I've run npx create react app to give us just the boilerplate React application. And if we just come over here and run npm start, we should be able to start up that application and it'll open up on the right side of our screen. But we don't need all of this boilerplate code, for example, all these CSS and test files. So we're just going to remove all of those. So let's get rid of these test files, logo, service worker, setup test, and this app CSS. We can just delete all those, get rid of all of the styles inside of index CSS. And in this app, we just get rid of this CSS file, this SVG file, and let's here just return the text, hello world. And hopefully if we save this and save this, refresh over here, we should see still not working. Looks like in our index, we need to remove service worker stuff. We'll remove that. And now if you save, we can see we get the text hello world. I can zoom that in a little bit, make it easier to see. And now what I want to do is create a new folder for all of our components that we're going to create. And I'm just going to move app.js inside there. We'll probably have to refresh our page to get it to load. There we go. Make sure that this up here autocorrects to /components/app. Otherwise, it's not referencing the app component in our components folder. So now that we have that done, we have our components, we have a CSS file, and we have our base app. So we can actually get started writing this CodePen clone. And of course, the most important part of the CodePen clone is going to be these text editors up here. Let me just zoom this out a little bit. These text editors up here. So in order to get those text editors, let's open up our terminal down here, type in npm I, and we need to install two libraries. The first one is called CodeMirror. This is going to be the text editor we use. And the next one is going to be called React CodeMirror 2. And what this is going to do is allow us to actually use the CodeMirror text editor inside of React easily with a custom component. So this is just going to make working with CodeMirror so much easier. Now the next step inside of our app component here, I want to set up the basis for this. What we essentially have is this top section up here, this bottom section, and then our three text editors. So let's kind of get our boilerplate, generic HTML down for what that's going to look like. We're essentially going to return two divs, this top section and this bottom section. So we need to wrap everything in a fragment so that we can return these two separate divs. So we can have a div here, and then copy that down, and the second div is going to be our bottom section. And just to denote that these are our different panes, we're going to give them a class of pane, and this one's going to have a class of top pane because it's going to have some specific styles for it. And down here, we're going to have another one with a class name, and this is just going to say pane because our bottom pane doesn't have any generic specific classes for it. Now inside of this bottom pane, in order to render all this custom HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, we actually need to use an iframe. So let's just come in here with an iframe. We need to give it a title. In our case, we're just going to give it a title of output. And I'm actually going to move all these different attributes onto separate lines because there's going to be quite a bit that this iframe is actually going to do. And we'll just make it self-closing. The next thing we need inside of here is to say sandbox. And we want to say that we want to only allow scripts. This is just going to help a little bit with security so that when you run a CodePen application, it's not able to access a bunch of other things like the document cookies and such like that, because you don't want this iframe to be accessing all of that stuff, especially if you implement saving to a server and let someone else open this up. You don't want any malicious activity going on. Now the next thing I want to do is set here the frame border to 0. We don't want any border around this. We want to set the width to be equal to 100% because we want it to be the full width, and same thing with height. We want that to equal 100%. Now up in this top pane section, we're essentially going to need to create three different editors, three text editors here for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we can just come in here and say editor. That's going to be a custom component we create ourselves, and we're going to want three of these. So let's create that component now. We'll call it editor.js. and just type in RFC, hit tab. That'll give you this boilerplate code. If you have an extension called ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets, super useful. I highly recommend you download it for these quick little typing sections. So let's just make sure we save all this and come over here and import our editor from /editor. There we go. And now inside of here, we can just output the text editor, for example. And if we come over here, you can see we have the text editor being printed out 3 times because we're rendering 3 different editors. And right now our iframe isn't doing anything because we haven't given it any content to render. That's perfectly okay for now. Now inside of our editor here, we can actually get to work on actually rendering our editor. And to do that, we actually need to import a few files. The first thing we need to import is from codemir/lib/codemir.css. This is all of the styles related to this text editor that we're going to be using. The next thing we want to do is import our theme. So in our case, we can do codemir/theme/material.css. This is all the CSS styles for the material theme that we're going to be putting on all of our editors. And then we want to import the languages we're going to use. So we can say codemir/mode. And then first of all, we want to do XML. This is going to be HTML essentially. They just call it XML here. Then what we're going to do is copy this down. We're going to have one for JavaScript. So we can say /JavaScript/JavaScript. And then lastly, we want to do one for CSS. So we've imported our base CSS, our theme CSS, and then all of the JavaScript related to the different languages we're going to use. So that way all the syntax highlighting works properly for XML, JavaScript, and CSS. And like I said, XML is essentially the same as HTML. They're going to work exactly the same. Now with that out of the way, we can actually import our text editor. It's going to be called controlled. And we're just going to rename this to controlled editor, just so it's easier to know what's working on. And we can get that from React CodeMir too. So this is going to be an editor that we can actually control the input and output on with our own on-change event handlers and our own value, just like you would with essentially any other generic input inside of React. Now let's go back over here to see kind of what our editors are going to be looking like. We have this container that wraps everything with this top section that contains our title as well as our open and close button. And then this bottom section is essentially the entire controlled editor here. So what we're first going to have is a div that has the class name of editor container. And this is going to be for handling this entire section. And inside of here, we're going to need another div. And this one's going to be for our top section, which is going to be our editor title. So inside of this editor title, we essentially want to have this display text here, HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. So we're just going to pass that into our editor as display name. And we can just render that down here. Display name. There we go. And then also inside of this editor title, we want to have a button. And this button is going to be our open close button. For now, I'm just going to put O/C for open close, but we're going to actually handle this, icon later. We're just not going to worry about that right away because it's not super important for the beginning of this tutorial. Now, the final thing we need underneath our title here is going to be our controlled editor. And it's going to be self-closing. And essentially, we're going to have a bunch of different things we're going to need to set up in here. Our first is going to be an on-before change handler. And this essentially works as the same as an on-change event handler for any other input. We just have to call it on-before change here. We're going to pass it a function called handleChange. We're also going to set the value, which we're just going to create a variable called value for. We'll do that up here. And then also, we're going to pass in here a class name. This is just so we can do some custom styles. We'll call it CodeMir wrapper. And then finally, we need a bunch of different options. And these options are from the CodeMir library. So for example, we want to wrap all of our lines. So we're going to say line wrapping is true. We're going to say lint is true. We're also going to say our mode is going to be the language we pass in. And that is going to come from our props. So let's just put that up here, language. And actually, let's just get this as props and we'll destructure it down here. So we can say const, we're going to have language, and we're going to have also here the, display name. Set that equal to props. There we go. That way it's just easier to read all of this. And then finally, we're going to have line numbers set to true, just so we can see our line numbers. It's going to give us this really basic editor over here. We can save that. And now what we need to do is essentially set up this value and this handleChange. So up here, we're going to get our value from the actual editor here in our props. And also we're going to get an onChange coming from our props as well. This is what we're going to call with our new value. So we can just create a function called handleChange. And this handleChange function is a little interesting because it uses this before change here. It's actually going to get the editor. It's going to get some data. And then finally, the thing we care about is this value here as our third property. And we can just call onChange with that value. And it looks like I accidentally imported on here. Let's just get rid of that. Now we can save. And hopefully if we come over here, we'll see that everything's working. We have our text editors. And of course, nothing's really hooked up because we're not passing any on changes in there. But we have our text editors. We have these open close buttons. We just need to start passing things into our editor. Also, you'll notice we don't have this dark theme. We still have our light theme. So down here in our editor, let's make sure we pass in a theme. And that is our material theme here. Now, if we save, you should see we get that dark theme, which looks much better than the light theme. So now back inside of our app.js here, we have our editor. And you remember we need to pass in our language. And this first one's going to be for HTML, which you remember we had to call XML just because of the way CodeMirror works. We need to pass in a display name, which in our case is just going to be HTML. We need to pass in our value, which we don't really know what that's going to be yet, so we're just going to leave that blank. And then we need to set an onChange here, which we also don't know exactly what that's going to be. Let's just set these onto different lines here to make it easier to work with. There we go. So the next step we have is to really worry about this value and this onChange. And for now, we're just going to use state for that. So we can say use state. We can come down here and we can say const HTML and set HTML is going to be equal to use state. And by default, we're just going to have an empty HTML. So now here, our value is HTML and our onChange is set HTML. And that is essentially our entire HTML editor done. We give this a quick save. You can see our text HTML showed up here. And if we type, this is actually setting the HTML variable here inside of our state every single time we make a change, because we're passing down that set HTML to update onChange. Let's quickly do the exact same thing for CSS and JavaScript. So we'll do CSS, JS. There we go. And we can just copy this editor down here twice. And this one's going to be CSS and set CSS. And then down here, we're going to have JavaScript. We'll just say JS in the title. We have JS and our set JS. And now we can change our HTML, CSS, and our JavaScript. And we're getting nice syntax highlighting. For example, if I want H1, something H1, as you can see, we're getting that nice syntax highlighting, which is exactly what we want. We're even getting error linting, which is great. So now before I start going crazy, getting all of this hooked up so we can actually render it down here in our iframe, I first want to set up some styles because right now everything we have on this page is really, really ugly to look at. In this index.html, let's first get rid of all of our margin on our body. Just pushes everything up to the side. That looks really good. And we're going to select our top pane. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to set it to have a background color slightly different than this background color for our text editor. So we can say background color here is going to be HSL 225, 6%, and 25%. And if we save that, you can see that we get a slightly different color than what we have for our text editor, just to give them a little bit of contrast from one another. Then we can actually style each one of our individual panes. We know that we want each one to essentially be half the height. As you can see over here, we have one being the top half, one being the bottom half. So we can set the height of each one to 50 VH. And we also want to use Flexbox to style these, so we'll just set it to be display flex. Now if you come over here, you can see all of our text editors are on the top, and our iframe down here is on the bottom. Let's continue with our styling and move on to our editor container. This is the thing that wraps each one of our different editors. So as you can see, this kind of section over here that wraps each one of our editors. What we're going to do for here is we're going to set the flex grow to be 1. That's going to essentially make them grow so that they fill the entire space. As you can see, our text editors got wider than when we did that, so they fill the entire space, which is great. We also want to set the flex bases to 0 so that they all are exactly the same size. That'll make it easier to work with everything. We're going to set display here to flex so we can style the things inside of here. And since we want them to style from the top to the bottom, we're going to set the flex direction to column. Now, if I save that, you shouldn't notice any change, which is perfect. Now, let's add a little bit of padding. So we'll use 0.5 rem just to give some space between each one of our editors. And also, I want to set the background color here to be that same HSL 225, 6%, and 25%. And there we go, we can save. And you can see we have our editors already looking very similar to our editors over here. They're spaced out nicely and look pretty good. We just have a lot of minor tweaks to go from, rounding the corners and getting the text color proper. So in order to get started with that, we can select that editor title An editor title, if you remember correctly, is just that top section up here with our text as well as our close button. So in our editor title, we again are going to use Flexbox to lay these out. And since we want to space them around from each other, we'll say space between. And what that's going to do is push the button to the far right and the text on the far left. I'm also going to use a background color here, which uses that same 225 6%, but I want to make this one darker, so we'll do 13% as the lightness. And that's going to give us this nice dark color up here. But to contrast that, we need to set our color to white so that our text color actually shines through. Then to add a little bit of spacing from everything, we'll use 0.5 REM for everything except for our very last side is going to be 1 REM. That just makes this HTML text a little bit further out from this left-hand side. Because if we also made this 0.5 REM, it just is a little bit too close for my liking. So I think 1 REM looks just a little bit better. Then we can round our corners. So we can say border top right radius is 0.5 REM. We can do the exact same thing for the top left, and that's going to round the top corners of all of our different editors, which looks really good. So now let's work on actually rounding out the bottom of our editors as well. To do this, all we need to do is take our code mirror wrapper, which we already have put a class on. We need to set the flex grow here to be 1. That's going to make it grow essentially to fill the entire height. We also want to set our border bottom right radius to be 0.5 REM. And we want to get the bottom left radius to be the same. And just make sure we take overflow and set it to hidden. Now if we save that, you'll notice that these bottom borders down here actually aren't grounded as much as they should be. And the reason for that, if we zoom out a little bit, is you'll notice this code mirror section doesn't actually drop all the way down to the bottom of our screen. So what we need to do is override the default style for the class code mirror. And all we want to do is set the height to be 100%. And we're going to mark that as important. This is going to make sure that this overrides the default style from the editor, which has a set static height, and overrides that to 100%. Now if we save, you can see it expands to the full height. If I just zoom in here, you'll notice the rounding on the bottom, and the top is exactly the same because it's now filling 100% of the height. So now with that done, we have most of the styling done other than this button over here, but we're going to come back to that because the more fun part of this application is actually getting all of this HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to render down in this iframe. And to do that, we need something called a source doc. So what we could do is we could create a variable called source doc, which is going to be equal to essentially a string here, and that string is going to have HTML. Whoops, not capitalized, HTML. And we need to close off that HTML. Essentially, we're just building an HTML document. Inside of here, we're going to have our body, which contains the HTML that is inside of this text box here. We're going to do another thing, which is going to be for our style sheets. That's going to be our CSS. And we're also going to have a script here, and that script is going to be for our JavaScript. Just like that. And now we can take this source doc and essentially put it inside of our iframe here. So we can say source doc is equal to, whoops, source doc. There we go. So now if I come over here and type something in HTML, you'll notice it renders down here, but it renders immediately. And this is all right. It's not terrible, but the problem is that if you have a lot of complex code and you do this render every single time you change a character, it can kind of slow down the browser and cause it to start getting a bit sluggish. So a good thing we can do is essentially cause this to only happen after a certain delay. We can put in a use effect here. And what we can do is just say use effect. And what we want to do is anytime our HTML, CSS, or JavaScript changes, so we'll say HTML, CSS, or JS, what we want to do is create a timeout. So we'll say timeout is equal to set timeout. And what we want to do is say essentially only after 250 milliseconds will we actually run this code. And this code is just going to create this source doc. We're going to call a function called set source doc. We're going to pass it in that string. And we'll just create a new state for that called source doc and set source doc is equal to use state. And it's just going to be an empty string by default. So now essentially what we've done is we've moved this timeout into this use effect instead, and we're only setting the source doc if there's been a 250 millisecond delay. What happens if we change HTML, CSS, or JavaScript during that 250 milliseconds? We don't want to re-queue this, essentially recreate our timeout. What we want to do is cancel the old timeout. So we can just run a function called clear timeout. We can pass it in our timeout. So this is going to clear out this update and it's going to create a brand new one every time we change this. So the only time we're ever setting our source doc is if there's a 250 millisecond delay between us typing, which essentially means that we're either done typing or taking a slight pause. So let's save this to see if it works. If we just type a bunch of stuff, you'll notice it's not updating. As soon as I pause for 250 milliseconds, it's going to update down below. Same thing, we can make a bunch of changes, wait 250 milliseconds, and it'll update at the bottom. And that's exactly what we want. We could even make this longer. You can make it a 1000 millisecond delay, so essentially 1 second. And now if I make some changes, wait a second, it's going to update down here. 250 I find is a pretty good speed though, because most people type more than one key every 250 milliseconds if they're actually typing, and those little bit of pauses are good ways to get you to update essentially as quick as possible after you're done typing. So now to make sure this all works, let's just create an H1. We'll say hello world, close that off. There we go. We can also, inside of our CSS, say that our body is going to have a color of red. Okay, we know that works. And then in our JavaScript, we essentially want to do something a little bit different. We'll just say document.body.style.background is going to be equal to green, for example. And as you can see, that's updating our color to green. We changed this to blue. Now we have a blue background. So we at least know all of this code is working. So the next step is going to be making this close button and open button actually function properly, because that's a really big part of CodePen, is being able to close off the stuff you don't need and only have the stuff you're currently working on actually open and working with. So inside of our editor, we need to set up a local piece of state. So we'll just say in here, use state, and come down here. We can say const open and set open is equal to use state. And by default, we're going to have all of our text editors be open. Now what we can do is we can essentially take this class here, turn it into a string interpolation instead. Let's just make sure we have that set up correctly. So we're going to have our editor container, and then we're going to have a little function here, which essentially is going to say, if open is true, then we don't want any additional classes. But if open is false, then we want to have a collapsed class. So with that set up, all we need to do inside of our index here, CSS file, we're going to create an editor container.collapsed selector. And all we want to do is change our flex grow to be 0. So it's not going to grow at all. And then in our editor, in order to update that on our button here, we can just set here an on click. We're going to set that equal to a function, which is just going to invert our current open. So we can say set open based on our previous open, and it's going to just invert that. So not previous open. This is just going to essentially go from being open to not open and from not open to open. So now if I click this, you can see we can expand and collapse every single one of these as much as we want. And it's just that flex grow property that's doing all of that for us. A slight problem you might notice though is if we have a bunch of text inside of here and we click close, you notice it's only getting as small as our actual text. A really easy way to get around that is inside of our index CSS. We can create another style selection for editor that is collapsed. And all we want to do, oops, one too many in there. All we want to do with this is we want to select the code mirror -scroll class, and we're just going to set the position to be absolute. Now if we save, you can essentially see that's removed all of our normal width from this container here because we positioned it absolutely. So it's going to be as small as humanly possible. So it's not going to worry about how much text we have inside of it. It's just going to collapse as small as humanly possible. Now the last kind of step we have with this open close button is to actually get this really cool icon here that changes from open to closed whenever we click on it. So we're going to install some Font Awesome library to do that. So we can say npm I, and we just want to say @fort awesome, and make sure it's fort and not font, /react font awesome. So that's going to get the React version. We also want to install fort awesome /free solid SVG icons. That's going to be all free icons that we can use. And then finally, from fort awesome again, we want to get font awesome, oops, awesome, spell that correctly, SVG core. And this is essentially going to be the core library we need to actually render out all these different SVG icons. Now in our editor, we can actually use all of these different pieces to actually import these icons and actually use them. So here we can say import. And what we want to do is we want to get font awesome icon, and we want to get that from that fort awesome. We want to make sure it's @fort awesome react font awesome. That's just our React component that we're getting. And then we want to get an individual icon. We want to get the FA compress alt, and we also want to get the FA expand alt. This is just going to be these icons you see here for expanding and compressing. And those are going to come from those free icons. So we can just say free solid SVG icons right there. And now we can render this font awesome icon inside of our button. So instead of O/C here, we can say font awesome icon. We can pass in the icon. And if it's open, we're going to pass in the icon for closing it. So that's going to be the FA compress. Otherwise, we're going to pass in the expand icon, just like that. Then we can close this off. So now you should see over here that we have these icons, which is exactly what we want. And now we can work on styling it. So in order to do that, let's come in here. We'll set the type of this to button. And we're also going to set a class name here. And this class name is going to be expand collapse button. This is just so we can select this in our CSS. So let's just come down here, expand collapse button. What we want to do is set a load margin on the left of 0.5 rem. This is just so when we close our icon, it's not pressed right up against here, because that's just a little bit, janky looking. Next, we're going to get rid of all the generic button styles. So we're going to say background, none, border, none, and we're going to change the color to be white. And lastly, set the cursor to be pointer. Now when we click on it, you can see it's expanding and collapsing exactly like we want. You will notice a slight problem though. When we collapse this, we get these weird scroll bars. In order to fix that, we can just come in here and say that we want to have our overflow for our code mirror scroll section to be hidden. And we want to make sure that's set to important, so it overrides always. That's going to get rid of those annoying scroll bars. So now we no longer have those when we're in that collapsed mode. And now really the last step we have is that if we make changes here and refresh our page, we want them to be saved. So we're going to create a custom hook for that. We'll create a folder called hooks. And inside that hooks folder, we're going to create a new file called useLocalStorage.js. There we go. And we can do that RFC trick here. We won't need to worry about React, but we will need to have use effect and use state inside of here. And the way this use local storage hook is going to work is it's going to take in a key and an initial value. And this is essentially the key that we want to use in local storage, and initial value is just our generic initial value. So for example, here, all of these empty strings. So now what we can do is also create a variable called prefix. And this prefix is just going to be set to CodePen clone. And the reason I create these prefixes is I prefix the key with this prefix value. So that way, when you're working on localhost 3000, which you probably have tons of local storage variables stored in, it'll be easy to see which ones are corresponding with your exact application. This I highly recommend doing in any application. So now we can get our prefixed key, which is just equal to our prefix plus our key, just combines the two together. And now we can do the fancy stuff for our actual setting up our hook. So the first thing I want to do is use some state. So we'll say value and set value. Make sure this is capitalized. And we'll say use state. And here we're going to use the function version of use state because getting our value from local storage is pretty slow actually. So we only want to do that once if we have to. So we can get the JSON value from local storage, which is just local storage.getItem. We're going to use that prefixed key. Then if we have a value, so if JSON value is not equal to null, what we want to do is essentially just return the JSON parsed version of it, of our JSON value. So we're just returning the value from local storage if we have one. Otherwise, if we don't have a value in local storage, what we want to do is just use our initial value. So we're going to check if the type of initial value is equal to a function. If so, that means we're using the function version of useState. So we're going to return initial value, calling it as a function. Otherwise, if it's not a function, that just means it's a value. So we can just return initial value itself. So that's all of our code for setting up our value. Now we need to set up a use effect for what happens every single time that we change our value. So here we're going to put value as our only value to change down here, as well as our key, because if for some reason our prefixed key changes, then we know that obviously we need to resave it to local storage. And here all we're going to do is take local storage. We're going to set the item at the prefixed key as the JSON stringified version of our value. So this is just saving our value in local storage, and up here we're getting the value. Then down here, we're going to return this so it looks just like just like useState. So we're going to return the value as well as the set value function. So we're just getting these value and set value functions, making sure we're setting it initially to local storage, and then every time we update it, we're saving that back in our local storage. So we have that hook done. Now inside of our app, we can import that hook, use local storage. We want to get that from here, hooks / use local storage. And let's just replace these use states up here for HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript with the local storage version. we just need to give them names of HTML. Down here is going to be CSS. And down here, we're going to have JS. So now if I, for example, change our HTML, refresh our page, you can see that's persisting. Same thing if I change our CSS or our JavaScript, refresh the page, you can see each one of those is persisting those changes, and they'll be there whether I leave the page and come back a week later, a day later, a year later, it doesn't matter. And that's all it takes to create this CodePen clone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my full React course, which covers everything you need to know about React. I'll link in the description down below. So thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.